two ago, the Woodstock Ag Commission in the northeastern part of the state did a program on planning for agritourism under an RMA grant. And the town of Woodstock has been looking at adopting regulations for agritourism, and they thought it might be timely for us to do a program up there. So it worked out very well, because once we scheduled the program in Woodstock, we already did a lot of the research and had some of the materials. So when Jocelyn contacted me and said, could you bring a duplicate program over to Northwestern Connecticut, was like, this is great, because we've done this already. So with that, I'm going to launch into the topic tonight. What I'd really like to do about the formatting tonight, and this worked very well in Woodstock, is agritourism is a little bit complicated, okay, which is probably why we're all here. So what I would like to do tonight is get through my presentation. I'd like to hear from the farmers that are participating tonight, and then I'd really like to spend the bulk of the rest of the time on an open discussion, because I think probably many of you here from different communities have questions. You know, what are you looking to get out of tonight's program? What are you grappling with? What's working in your town? What's not? And I think we'll all benefit from that discussion. And that went very well up in Woodstock. So with that, I'm going to launch into the subject matter. The other thing, I'll just back up. When we did this in Woodstock, Delia Fay, who is a planner for the Northeastern COG, actually did about a half-hour presentation on the overview of planning and zoning. Why do we have zoning regulations? Why do we need regulations for agriculture and agritourism? I'm doing a little bit of an assumption that because many of you already sit on planning and zoning commissions or planning agencies, you already know how planning and zoning works and why you need to have regulations to allow for agritourism, because it's always been my understanding, listening to planners, that if it's not allowed in zoning regulations, it's assumed to be prohibited. One of the things I hear from farmers when we have forums on developing regulations for agriculture, the farmers want to come and throw rocks at me. Like, what are you doing? We don't want to be regulated, what are you trying to do? And they don't understand that if they're doing some of these other activities on their farm, we're not looking to regulate your cows or how you grow your crops. It's the other aspects that may affect land use and activity on the farm that we look at developing regulations. And it's really hard to explain to the farmers that this is actually, if they're done right, is going to help you. Why? Because we can all then sleep at night, okay? And my goal is really to sleep at night, not so. Anyhow, so with that, I did not do this presentation. This was put together by Chris Loughton, who's with Farm Credit East, with their knowledge exchange. So I'm going to give you just a quick run through of Chris's presentation. I handed out a little handout that went around the table that says agritourism. This was something that Chris prepared in anticipation of putting a PowerPoint together. So I'm just going to run through this, and then my presentation is primarily going to be handouts and going over materials. But I didn't want to have Chris come all the way up here tonight, so I'm going to do this on his behalf. So the first thing we look at is, definitions. You all know you're working with your zoning regulations, you get into the weeds, and sometimes it's just the definitions. And I'm going to talk a little bit about definitions as well. So how do you define agritourism? It can be a little bit complicated. Are you talking about bringing people onto the farm? Anytime you bring people onto the farm, the general public, is that considered agritourism? If you have farm-based retail, is that agritourism? I think for the most part, what I heard in Woodstock and some of the other research that we did working with towns is really the agritourism is, and what towns are challenged with are the other activities that farms want to do that's not directly related to production. So you would think you're growing the crop, you're going to sell the crop. How do you market that crop if you're doing it through farm retail? I personally don't consider that agritourism. It's just marketing. It's how the farm sells their product. Okay, so really it's when the farm is looking to sort of sell or cash in or benefit from bringing people onto the farm and the experience of bringing people onto the farm. So, it could be everything. The classic model, as Chris brought up, is the dude ranch, out west where you have dude ranches. People come to the farm or onto the ranch, and then they have an experience of riding horses through the farm and learning about how ranches operate. So how do you define agritourism? There's challenges. And I think that's another reason why we're all here and why I was up in Woodstock, is when you start to push the boundaries of what's agriculture, what's directly related to agriculture, and therefore the agritourism is tied to agriculture, and that's part of my handouts, but also you're going to push the boundaries of what is actually a farm, okay? And then, of course, we all know you have to get it right because you have neighbors. And the other thing is, I think the reason we're all here is because more often than not, the farm is not in your commercial zone or your industrial zone or the center of town where a lot of activity takes place, where you have parking and you're used to having people walking around. The farms, more often than not, are in the back roads. Okay, so what you're doing, and what really creates the neighbor conflict and why we need good regulations for agritourism, is because you're bringing people onto the farms in what's generally are residential zones, or I live in Eastern Connecticut, we also have residential agricultural zones. So that's a big difference between having a repurposed commercial building in the center of town where somebody turns it into an event space, and it's great, but it's in the center of town where you would expect these things. This activity is going on in the back roads, okay, of your communities. And these are some of the other things to consider. We're not going to go tonight into what the farmers should think about when they're bringing people on, the liability part of it, the interaction with livestock. That's a different part of the agritourism. But it's also, any farm that's going to go down the road of agritourism really has to think about managing the risk and all of the management of the risk that goes along with what that means. But we're not going to go into that tonight. So there is a huge economic impact to the farms and value to having agritourism. And I did bring a few of these. It is available online. So in 2017, UConn updated the economic impacts of Connecticut agriculture. I did bring some of them with me, help yourself. But in there, it says that, basically it states that the direct agritourism revenue in the state of Connecticut is $16.2 million. It's huge. Direct-to-consumer farm sales, total revenue. However, they do admit, UConn admits, that some of this is unquantifiable. How do you put a price tag on the value that somebody gets from coming to your farm and learning what a farm's about so that they'll support agriculture? How do you put a price tag on that? Okay, so it's also the value, other values that are hard to put a number on. This is the overall impact of agriculture in the state of Connecticut, $4.1 billion industry, over 21,000 jobs. One thing to keep in mind, I'm going to talk about definitions. In our state definition of agriculture, we do not include agritourism. And that's another challenge, and we'll go into a little bit about why that is. This is sort of a busy little chart that Chris found, and I gave it to you in the handout because I think it's easier to understand in the handout. But basically what it's looking at is, and I had to study this in anticipation of this, but you have sort of the core part of agritourism, and then you have some peripherals that go along with the agritourism. And the further out you get from the core of what you're doing, the farther out you get, what are the benefits? The concerts on the farm, the wildlife viewing. It gets further and further out, ag fairs on the farm. These are some other numbers, and we're not going to go too much into the numbers. It's all in the handout here. But this is across the United States. So you can just see the percentages of change. And it's not just Connecticut. Across the United States, agritourism is booming. And you can see it has steadily increased since 2002. So, you know, clearly it's a benefit to our farms, which is why we're here. And then you have the intangible impact, or the multiplier effect to your communities, for better or worse. People come and visit the farm. Are they going to visit a restaurant in your community on the way home? You know, use the gas stations, whatever. So there's always a benefit to bringing people into communities from an economic impact perspective. And then this is just a little bit of a conclusion. Okay, and that's Chris's contact information. Incredibly knowledgeable person on ag-related issues, statistics, does a lot of studies. I'm sure if you had a particular study you were looking for and you emailed Chris, I can almost guarantee you he either has it available or he'll spend some time crunching some numbers to get that for you. So with that, I'm going to launch a little